Rabbi say we're on Daf Lamed Amid Beis, and we're up to Ella. Now, in my Gemara, Ella is the third word in a line which is smack in the middle of Daf Lamed Amid Beis. It's a little bit below Tosis Divir Maskil E, about 5 lines, 6 lines below that Tosis, and the first word in the line is Shemesh. And if you scoot along with your eye, you'll see the words Ella Idi V'Idi. Now, just to review, we had a contradiction with regard to the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. According to one recording, Rabbi Yehuda says that a Mitzorah who was Tovel on the 7th day of his purification, and now he's up to the 8th day when he has to bring his karbanos for kapara in order to complete his tara process, he needs absolutely no additional tefillah. And according to another brisa, Rabbi Yehuda requires an additional tefillah on the 8th day of his taras. So the Gemara says now, Idi ve'idi did tavil. Both brisos, both recordings of Rabbi Yehuda are talking about a scenario in which on the 7th day he was tovel for his taras. So what's the difference now between the two brisos? We understand very well the brisa that records Rabbi Yehuda as waiving the requirement of tefillah on the 8th day because he was tovel the night of the 7th. But Ha, says the Gemara, the brisa that requires, according to Rabbi Yehuda, a second tefillah on the 8th, in addition to the 7th, the asich adaite. The Mitzorah was Masiach Daito, which means min hatara. Losam libo li shomer min hatuma. He was not being careful to guarantee himself that he didn't come in contact with tuma. For example, he may have gone into a place, a building. He entered into a building that might have a mess in it, a corpse, and he contracted tumas oil, tumas mess. And he cannot testify one way or the other because it wasn't in his das. He wasn't intending or being meticulous about avoiding a place with his tumah. Therefore, that brisa in that exceptional case of the asach hadaite requires a second tefillah on the 8th day. But the brisa that says, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he doesn't need a second tefillah, the lo asach hadaite. He was very careful to be nishmar min hatuma. He could tell you on a stack of Bibles, I did not come into a building where there was a mess. And I was very careful. I made sure that it was a very small abode, or I checked it out before with somebody else who went in, and he said it's clear, all roads are clear, and I can testify that I did not contract Tuma. Says Rabbi Yehuda, there's no need and there's no purpose to repeat a tefillah on the 8th day where we know he's taught. You'll ask me, what about a Kohen who enters into the Beis HaMikdash on a morning and he says, I'm coming here to do the avodah and I know I'm tar? Rabbi Yehuda could agree and will agree that he needs a tefillah. Why? Because we have to remind him, hey, where were you hanging out? Where'd you go in and out the last couple of days? Did you possibly contract to him? But with regard to a Mitzorah, when we have two conditions that were fulfilled, we can check off A plus B. A, he went to the mikvah and he was tovel on the night of the 7th, and B, he was not mesiach das, and he was shomer es atzom in atuma. Then there's no need for an additional tevila on Yom Shmini. So the Gemara asks, wait a second. If you're interpreting the brisa, that the reason why Rabbi Yehuda agrees that you need a second tefillah in the case of Mitzorah on the 8th day is because he was Mesiach Das, then we have to worry about the possibility that he went into a building where there was a corpse, in which case he is a Tomei Mes, and we require Hazah b'Shlishi b'Shvi. It's Hazah, Shlishi, Shvi, boy. We're going to need the good old Ephraim Paraduma, which we read about a few days ago. And we're going to have to do a Hazah on Yom Shlishi and Yom Shvi, because he wasn't Nishma and Atuma, and possibly he entered into an Olam Mes, and he contracted Tumas Mes. He's going to need Hazah from the Ephraim Parah on Tuesday, not Tuesday, but Yom Shlishi, and on Yom Shvi. And then he can be Tovel. Now, the law is that Harev Shemesh, let me say it this way, a Tevilla that took place before Harev Shemesh would only be meaningful, that Tevilla registers on the halachic Richter scale, if everything is clear. But if he's got to go through a process now of Hazah on Shlishi and Shvi, then that Tevilla of Shvi is completely gone. It's completely invalidated. He's going to need, number one, Hazah and Shlishi, number two, Hazah and Shvi. Then he's going to go into the mikvah, and he's going to have to wait till Erev Shemesh. So the Erev Shemesh post the first Tevilla, if we're afraid that he subsequently went into an Olam Mes, is totally meaningless. It's gone. So you need Tevilla before Erev Shemesh, when that's all you need. And here, he needs Hazah on Shlishi and Shvi, and then after he has Hazah and Shvi, now he can go to the mikvah, wait till Erev Shemesh, and then he's taught. So that when the Brisa says that he can enter into the Mikdash after he was Tovel and Yom Shmini, right? That was the problematic Brisa that seems to undermine Rabbi Yehuda's Shita. So he answered, well, that's because he was Mesiach Das since the Tevilla of yesterday. But then he needs a Tevilla on Yom Shmini, and then he can, carte blanche, he can enter into the Mikdash. What are you talking about? He would need Hazah b'Shlishi v'Shvi. No way that the Tevilla of Yom Shmini can help him in that situation. Yomer Abdistoi Bar Masud, Omer Ab Yochanan, Hesef Das, Tzarech Hazah, Shlishi v'Shvi. Now, when I read this Gemara of Rabbi Yochanan, I pushed jumped out of my seat. Hesech Hadas is Tzarech Hazah Shlishi Shvi. What does that mean? I'm walking around the streets. I remember when I was a youngster, I think I was 16 years old. I got a job as a runner. You know what a runner is? For New Yorkers, and you might have an idea. A runner in New York, at least, means that you run on the, in the area of the stock market. They send you back with documents, back and forth, because documents have to be signed when you buy stocks or whatever it is. So I was running, I probably went into 50 buildings in Lower Manhattan, during a course of a couple of hours. And that gave me enough money to buy a piece of pizza. No, just exactly. So I don't know. I can't testify on any given day that for sure every building I entered into on that day was clear of any tumas mess. Could Rabbi Yochanan be telling me that anyone who doesn't know exactly where he went on any particular day, he can't swear on a stack of Bibles that he didn't contact with a corpse? He needs Hazah and Shlishi and Shvi? We assume that he's a Tomei Mes? So thank God I found a Pirush here that's quoted in the Masifta called Pirush Rabbeinu Eliakim. Again, I'm not familiar, apparently one of the Rishonim. And he says the following. And we see reflections of this also in a Tosfos later on in Masechet Yoma, that we're talking about a Tamei Sheretz or a Tamei Nevela. So let's give a simple case. A man carried a dead Sheretz, or he came into Tumas Maga with a Nevela, a dead animal. So they are Tmeim. But of course, in these cases, they're Tmeim one day. In other words, that day they will have, after Mikvah, Herav Shemesh in their Tohoru. Once he's a Tamei, so if he wasn't Mesiach Das, everything is wonderful. But if he was Mesiach Das, then we need Hazah. Apparently, what the Rabbeinu Eliakim is saying is that once you're a Tamei and you want to undergo a process of purification, now we have to ask you, can you guarantee that you will become Tar and remove your state of Tumah because you have no additional problems of Tumah? Were you meticulous about it? Were you Nishmar Min HaTumah? And Hesech Hadas now requires Hazah on Shlishi and Shvi. The Hesech Hadas, Kevan Shisi Hadas, Yesh Chashash Nitma Lemes. And therefore, the case of Mitzorah, who is certainly Tameh, Kevan Shisi Hadato, Tzorech Limnos Shuv Shivas Yomim, with Hazah and Shlishi and Shvi, Kidei L'Tarosa. So basically what we're saying is that anyone who needs Tevilla for Tumah X, Y, or Z, whatever that Tumah is, we're not going to rely on that Tumah, on that Tevilla. We're not going to recognize the validity of that Tevilla to be Matayr him unless we are guaranteed that that Tevilla will generate Tara, which means that he didn't go into an OMS. And how do we guarantee that this Tevilla from Sheretz or from Nevela, Tumas Sheretz, Tumas Mitzorah, how do we know that this Tevilla is definitely going to achieve his Tara? Because he wasn't Mesiach Das. And he can testify I was Nishvar Min HaTumah. But if he's Tameh, and he was Tovel L'Tumasa, and there's a possibility that he was at the same time Tameh with Tumas Mes, which means that the 7 days of healing from his tzaras is not going to generate his tara, because in Tumas Mes he needs Hazav Shlishi V'Shvi. If he was Mesiach Das, then we cannot guarantee that his Tevila was effective to be Matayr him, and there's no such thing as a halfway measure over here, either your Tar or your Tameh. The Tevila that is questionable, because maybe perhaps he was in contact with a dead body, he was an olam mess, and he was Mesiach Das. He cannot testify to the effect that he was Shomer Min HaTumah. Then we have doubts about his Tevila, and once we have doubts about his Tevila, he has a Cheskes Tameh, and with a Cheskes Tameh, we're going to expand that Chazaka to include even Tumas Mes. Maybe, perhaps, he went into a building without a Tumas Mes, with a mess. And he needs Hazah b'shlishi b'shvi. So the Gemara, now according to Rabbeinu Eliakim, is very gishmak. The Gemara is saying, how can you interpret that brisa that requires on the part of Mitzorah an additional Tevila on the 8th day? And Rabbi Yehuda says, in general, you don't require, but here he does require because he's Mesiach Das. If he's Mesiach Das, what is Rabbi Yehuda accomplishing by requiring a Tevila on Yom Shmini? That Tevila will not be meaningful. Because if he was Mesiach Das, that's why his tefillah of yesterday of the 7th day is not going to remove and uproot the necessity of a tefillah on Yom Shmini. Well, guess what? The tefillah on Yom Shmini is not going to be meaningful, because who's going to tell you that tefillah on Yom Shmini is Mitarim? Maybe he's Tomei, but to his mess, he needs Hazah b'shlishu b'shvi. That's what I get from Rabbeinu Eliyahu. Ella, the Gemara says, I need another. Go back to the drawing board to reconcile these two brises. There was no Hesech Hadas, and therefore there's no question that the Tefillah on Yom Shvi should be a valid Tefillah. And there's no reason why one of the two brises records Rabbi Yehuda is requiring a second Tefillah on Yom Shmini. But Had Tavel al Das Bias Mikdash, Had Lo Tavel al Das Bias Mikdash. Now, for me personally, this is a revolution. This is like, it's changing my whole understanding of what Tevilla is all about. And the Gemara is establishing that if Tevilla has to accomplish a certain goal, and the Tara that you're aspiring for is a Tara for X, then your Tevilla has to be implemented for the purpose of X. And if that Tevilla will accomplish Y and be mitarim for Y, it's not enough that he went to the mikvah and he was tovel, kedasu kedin. He has to have an intention that that Tevilla is done for Y, for that specific purpose. Let's take the case of Mitzorah. Why is he being tovel on the seventh day? And the answer is simple. He wants to get rid of the state of tumah of a Mitzorah. He wants to retire himself. Says the Gemara, if his intention is to retire himself, such that now he cannot transmit tumah to anybody else, but he didn't have in mind specifically that he wants to achieve Tara so that he can enter into the base of Mikdash, then he's not allowed to enter into the base of Mikdash. He'll need a second Tevilla, which is performed explicitly for the purpose of Bias Mikdash. And now we're splitting his Tevilla into two different Tevillas. There's a Tevilla of Shmini and there's a Tevilla of Shvi. The Tevilla of Shvi of yesterday, last night, that was for the sake of Tara, because all he had in mind was Tara. Get me out of this situation that I'm a Mitzorah. People are running away from me because I'm a Mitzorah. They're sending me chutz l'machnas. Let me be off with it. The Tefillah of Yom Shmini is for the purpose of entering into the Mikdash, a second Tefillah, because on Yom Shmini, we're going to have what's called Matan Bahonos, which means he puts his thumb into the Zorah, and we're only going to allow him to do so when he has a separate Tefillah. Why? Because his original Tefillah on Yom Shvi, he did not have in mind Shem Bias Mikdash. So I'm going to read to you a summary of a Gemara in Chagiga on Daf Yud Chesed Beis. Kol Tevilla shetovel l'taraso nithar litzorech hadavar shelishmo tava v'eino nithar lidavar acher mimenu. Now, it could be that in certain cases will apply, if you're familiar with the phrase yesh b'chlal masayim mana. But let's say one Tara is on level X, we'll call it a relatively kal, and the other Tara is level Y, which is chamur. Because all the issues of Tumah v'Tara regarding a Mitzorah are relatively kal, but Biel and Mikdash, that's chamur. Because if he still is in a state of Tumah as a Mitzorah and he enters into the Mikdash, that's a chiyuv of that's a condemnation on the most severe level. And therefore, he needs specific intention, says the Gemara in Chagiga, for Bias Mikdash. And what's the case in the Gemara in Chagiga? Interesting. You have the case of a person, let's say he's a Kohen, and he wants to eat Maser Sheni, which is any Jew is allowed to eat Maser Sheni if he's tar, and he wants to eat Truma. Truma, if eaten by a Kohen who's Tameh, is a Chiv Misa B'dei Shamayim. That's really Chamur. Maser Sheni, if he eats it B'tumah, that's a violation of Allah. It's relatively kal. And the Gemara says in Chagiga, Taval, Kidei Sheyeh Mutar, B'Maser Sheni. Oh, the Gemara goes through actually different cases. Let's say, for example, Tov aliyas mutar b'truma is hutar linyan truma v'lo inyan achilas kodshim, and Toval l'shem achilas ma'aseh is nitar l'ma'aseh but not l'truma. Again, it's a very complicated sugya there in Chagiga, but the sugya there sets up a hierarchy of different requirements of Tara vis-a-vis different elements, and there's a kal and a chamur. He's got to have the specific intention for the chamur. So we have now a reconciliation which the Gemara is happy with, although the Gemara is going to offer another alternative, but still the Gemara never rejects this reconciliation, that the brisa that Rabbi Yehuda requires a second tefillah on Shmini, that's a case where he did not have intention for bias Mikdash. Ibai, same in the Gemara says, I have another way of reconciling these two brisos of Rabbi Yehuda that contradict each other. Tani, lo mitzarayim amru ela kol adam. We're going to change the girsa of the brisa. Our girsa says lo mitzarayim bilvad amru, meaning that Rabbi Yehuda's requirement of tefillah in the case of someone who knows he's tar applies not only to a mitzvah but to kol adam. We're going to take out this girsa. Lo mitzoraim amru. Take out the word bilvad. Ella kol adam. And that means that Rabbi Yehuda is being reported as saying that a mitzvah will never need a second tefillah. He wasn't Mesiach Das, and he had in mind bias Mikdash. He doesn't need a second tefillah. But Rabbi Yehuda says that a regular person who's going into the Beis HaMikdash, Shar Kol Adam, a Rotzeli Konis Beis HaMikdash, is he requires tefillah even though he says he knows he's tar. A mitzorah doesn't need tefillah on the 8th day, a second tefillah, because he had a tefillah on the 7th day. And the brisa that we've been dealing with in all these answers, that the brisa says that lo mitzorah bilvad ela kol adam, meaning that Rabbi Yehuda requires that the mitzorah take a second tefillah, a second dip on the 8th day. That doesn't exist. There is no such brisa. That's a mistake in the transmission in the gears of the brisa. Lo mitzorah, leave out the word bilvad. In mitzorah, there's no need for a second tefillah. That's Rabbi Yehuda's shita, because he had a tefillah on the 7th day. But for kol adam, anyone who's entering into the Mikdash, we're going to require a tefillah. Ravina offers a third valid reconciliation. When Rabbi Yehuda says that there's a requirement of tefillah, lidivreim derabanan karmalu, lidi di mitzarein tar tefillah, he was tovil already on the 7th day, doesn't need a tefillah on the 8th day. But lididchu, you hold that he needs a second tefillah. Oduli easy mias. Wow, this is really fascinating. The Gemara is now, in the name of Ravina, suggesting that the Rabbanan require a second tefillah in the case of mitzorah, and only in the case of mitzorah. And the brisa that records machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim is addressing the issue of kol adam. A person wants to enter into the Mikdash and he knows he's tar. Does he need tefillah? And Rabbi Yehuda says we need that tefillah so that we jolt his memory, and he should start thinking, where was I in the last couple of days? Maybe I went into an olam mess, or for that matter, the last couple of weeks. And the Rabbanan say no. He knows he's tar. We don't have to put him over the coals. and remind him and jolt his memory. Maybe he came into. In the case of Mitzorah, that's where we disagree with you, Rabbi Yehuda, and we require a second view. And why? For Rabbanan, Mitzorah, Dayish B'tumah. Now, in my translation of Dayish, he writes, HaMitzorah haya murgal lagas B'tumah. I don't know enough linguistics here to tell you why the word Dayish means rugil, murgal. I would have said Daesh means something else entirely, but be that as it may, I'll be mavatal my das to his das. And the Mitzorah is already used to Tumah. He's been in a state of Tumah for a long time. The only action that he did to change his state from Tumah to Tara was last night's mikvah. But he's still in a mentality of Tumah. Is therefore Choshishin Shema Noga B'Dover Tumah. And therefore, we need a second tumah. Again, we're not worried about tumah's mess. That would require hazah b'shlishi b'shvi. But we're afraid that maybe he came in contact with a sheretz or somebody who was tamei. And therefore, since he's ragil b'tumah, so imagine, 12 hours have passed for this mitzorah since his last tefillah. Chacham say he needs another tefillah. Why? Rabbi Yehuda says that's ridiculous. The answer is because he's murgal betumah, he's dayish betumah. If he's a person who's dayish betumah, he doesn't pay any attention. He's so used to being tameh. Who cares? It's like, again, I don't want to give a mashal from today, but they have these COVID hotels. I don't know if they still exist anymore. What are they called? Those hotels, the Corona hotels. Anyway, so imagine there was a point when there was a seger, and the only people in the entire state of Israel who were davening 3 times a day b'tzibur were Corona patients, because they were in a Corona hotel. If you're in a Corona hotel, everybody else around you and yourself included are all Corona patients. So we don't have to be careful and with social distancing, we can get together and have a minyan. The Kachava, there were certain Corona hotels that were occupied by Charedim, and they actually had 3 minyanim a day. It would pay off to get sent to such a hotel because we were all in quarantine. No one's davening mitzvah. Just get yourselves. Anyway, so this is called dayish b'tumah. He's already tameh. So if he's already tameh, he's in mitzorah. He's not careful about it. All right, he went to the mikvah on the night of the 7th, but he's still in that mental state of dayish b'tumah. He's not careful, and it could be that in the 12 hours between night and day, he came in contact with a chveis, a sheretz, and a vela, or a davar mitam. But kol adam, fascinating. Now we have the Rabbanan Lakula and Rabbi Yehuda Lachum. Kol adam lo dayish b'tumah, a person who has a cheskes tara, he was not tameh. He doesn't need another tefillah. He's not careless about tumah. He's very careful about tumah, and he's very careful to keep himself in a state of tara. And paradoxically, it's Rabbi Yehuda who said that a mitzorah doesn't need a second tefillah. He's not operating with this premise of dayish b'tumah. But kol adam, any other person who wants to enter into the Mikdash, even though he claims he's tar, we don't know that he's tar, and we're going to require tefillah. Fascinating. We went from minakotza lakotza. Rabbi Yehuda was always the mekil, and now he becomes the mach. Anyway, we see very clearly that Ravina holds in the second brisa that according to the Chachamim, against Rabbi Yehuda, kol adam, a regular person, does not need tefillah when he goes into the Mikdash. Now, in the first brisa, we recorded a machlokes between Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda, was that machlokes also relevant to Stam Kol Adam? Omle Abayla Rav Yosef. Nema, should we suggest that Rabbanan de Pligi Alei, the Rabbi Yehuda, the machlokes in the first brisa, where the Rabbanan say that the Mitzorah needs a second tefillah on Yom Shmini, maybe those Rabbanan hold like Kiben Zoma Svira. And Ben Zoma, if you recall, derived from a Kavachom from the Avodas Yom Kippur of the Kohen Gadol, and anyone going into the Beis HaMikdash, even though he's tar, requires tefillah, because he's coming from a makom where there's no onish kares, if you told me, to a makom that's coming to, right? He's going from Arabayas into the Mikdash. So certainly, says Ben Zoma, he requires tefillah. If the Kohen Gadol requires tefillah, and he's going from makom kadosh, how much more so a citizen, a rank and file citizen who's going from Harabayas into the Azor certainly requires tefillah. So this would be, says Abaye, a very plausible possibility as to how to understand the Chachamim in the first brisa as opposed to Chachamim in the second brisa. According to Ravina, Chachamim in the second brisa deny the requirement of tefillah to go into the Mikdash for Kol Adam. That doesn't exist. Could be, says Abaye, that the Rabbanan quoted in the first brisa, they maintain that everyone who goes into the Mikdash requires tefillah, and they might be on the side of Ben Zoma, and they derive it from a Kavachomer. V'haidik Toni Mitzorah. Why didn't the Chachamim say Stam Ben Adam has to do a tefillah when he goes into the Mikdash, and we would apply it for sure to a Mitzorah? Lo diach hakochad Rabbi Yehuda, because the Brisa wants to tell you how far Rabbi Yehuda went, and he was makil, and he lifted the requirement of a Mitzorah for a second tefillah on Yom Shmini. And anybody else who's entering the Mikdash requires tefillah. So the Bryce only formulated the machlokas in terms of a Mitzorah, even though, again, the Chachamim, based on the Kavachor Ben Zoma, would go as far as to say that anyone needs a tefillah, a Doraisa tefillah before he enters in the Mikdash. But the Brisa wants to be machadish to us how far Rabbi Yehuda went, and he completely alleviated the chiyuv tefillah in the case of Mitzorah. And why is that? Because last night on Yom Shvi he went and he was tovel himself. Odilma, what should we say? No, Shema Mitzorah Didayish Betuma. A Mitzorah is different. He's Ragil Betuma, and that's why he needs tefillah. But Shar B'nei Adam, they don't need tefillah, and therefore the Chacham in the first price and the Chacham in the second price are identical. Both of them alleviate the Kol Adam of his responsibility of tefillah. He knows he's tar, he can go into the Mikdash as such. It's only the case of Mitzorah, who's Dayish Betuma, there the Rabbanan require a second tefillah. Amalei, so Rav Yosef responds, and with this we'll end for today, Shiny Mitzorah the Dayish Betuma, that Enochinami, both the Rabban in the first price and the Rabban in the second price are the same Shita, and they all agree that Shar Kol Adam does not need Tefillah, and Mitzorah is different. He needs a second Tefillah, according to Chachamim, because he's Murgal Bituma. He's in that state of mind where he's absolutely carefree about where he goes and what he touches. He's not in the state of tar, he's in a mental state of tum. So this is where we're going to stop for today. Amalei Abaye Lirav Yosef. Mamish at the end of Daf Lamed Amid Beis. So let me take this opportunity to wish you all a great day.